But the tendency is that men tend to be attracted to women and women to men. And attracted in very selfish ways. So when men and women, and sometimes in few cases of exceptions for those who are homosexual, then even attraction between same sex, same principle going on, same thing. But generally, opposites are attractive, male to female and female to male. So when male and female come to the proximity of each other, then what tends to happen is arousal of intense selfishness. Intense selfishness, which in Sanskrit is called kama, and in English sometimes translated as lust, even though kama is much more pervasive, much more pervading, pervading, comprehensive than lust. And so because that is almost like a default reaction of a man when a man sees a beautiful woman, so therefore then religion says, okay, all men stay away from, all male renunciates, keep a decent distance from females, especially beautiful ones. But if we felt like that about sunsets, religion would come up with the very same stricture, stay away from sunset. You're sannyasi, don't look at the sunset. But female form, the form of sun, the colors that the sun creates by setting, the cloud, these are all morally neutral elements. They're neither good nor bad, they're divine energies of God, they're God's energies. But because we have issues the way we relate to them, therefore we have to sort of polarize. But if we take this polarization as real, then we end up with all kinds of issues, like we see in modern times, the two communities divided. So, I shall end there. And if there are any questions or comments, this is your chance. Yes, please.
I do remember hearing from the artists.
From
the artists down in LA that Prabhupada had said that an artist, it might be an unfortunate position because you could get held in the material world from one sunset.
Correct. You're right. Yeah, in other words, the way we relate to this world, that one could, observe the sun. See, for example, Prabhupada, on a number of occasions, when he was baited by morning sunlight, he said that he experienced the hand of God. Right? So when we see the sunset, instead of thinking, this is beautiful mastery of Krishna, we may just think, oh, this is beautiful, but in a very selfish way, we stay in this world. You're absolutely right.
It's a beautiful sunset. I am enjoying it rather than
correct.
Thank you, Krishna. I
yeah.
can't leave that.
In other words, that beauty becomes an excuse for us to further forget our relationship with God and who we are as a soul and a servant of God, and we're constantly in love with God and all that. And the list goes on. Cars, houses, you name it. It could be anything. But certain things tend to be more so than other. Like that. Thank you. Yes.
Bringing the two groups together, like integrate two groups, what are the activities ISKCON is taking actually?
What ISKCON is taking?
Physics and
I don't know. I'd have to think. Because first of all, ISKCON is, the way Srila Prabhupada conceived of ISKCON is actually quite beautiful. As one organization, it's like Beda and Abeda at the same time, division and no division, as one entity, but yet each ISKCON temple is like its own unit. And so it really, ISKCON is what we make it. And whatever effort one person or a group of persons within ISKCON take, we may call that ISKCON is doing something. But ISKCON in and of itself is not an entity, really. So what different devotees are doing, I don't know, but we do have a very powerful message that's not offending people, and it's really putting things in a very balanced perspective. I mean, in initial days of ISKCON, we did have issues with this kind of polarization. Now, you were mentioning sunset, but I remember men hating women. Because in the Vedic literatures, there's lots of statements about renunciation, that one should be renounced, which does not mean that one hates anything, but that one does not have feelings of selfish possessiveness over other beings or things. And attempting to transplant those teachings in modern America, Srila Prabhupada encountered devotees' inability to comprehend the larger picture. So you had devotees polarizing this. It was not uncommon for a renunciate to express his hatred of women, which means that person is in illusion. Because the real picture is to see God everywhere, ultimately. I mean, of course, to the extent we're addicted to certain things, we have to stay away. Sorry, I'm reiterating this because this is something that people trip over time and time and time again. It appears to be a very difficult thing to understand. Because the other mistake often committed was to, in the name of seeing everything as God's energy and as divine, they freely engage with everything, even with things they feel addiction towards, and then they commit all kinds of embarrassing activities. In other words, if men are addicted to selfish association with women and other way around, then they should not ignore that. They should understand that that's not right. But they should also not ignore this. In other words, be a little conservative how you associate with women. And that men and women dress somewhat conservatively, rather than sexually provocative ways of dressing, which is very common in modern days. And this, again, very difficult for some people to understand. What's this specifically in terms of scientific community? Personally, maybe some devotees are out there, trying to communicate things, and I'm sure there are. But to a large extent, the scientific community has become so militant that requires a militant activity. And we see that Srila Prabhupada took a very aggressive stand towards scientific community, materialistic scientific community, like this die-hard and empiric scientific community. And he was giving devotees, forget what the budget was for BI, Bhaktivedanta Institute, which was an institute Srila Prabhupada started to introduce metaphysics to the physics community, and he was given a huge monthly budget, which was unprecedented, and they couldn't even spend it. That budget's still there, but not many devotees are taking up this effort because it's quite a difficult field. Like that, but anyhow, that's yet another topic. Is that okay? Yes.
I just wanted to point out from that in about the 1890s or so in the U.S. until about the 1940s, the philosophers, the artists, the musicians started bringing over spiritualism, as they called it, and basically impersonalism. That's why we see it here in Sacramento so rooted. There's so many spiritualism stores, but they haven't heard of Krishna at all.
Yeah, it certainly lacks substance. I mean, they're also sort of psychologically rebelled to their against again Christian conservatism, and it was a powerful wave, specifically in the 60s, right? Went on into 70s and then sort of died down in the 80s, by the 80s. But it lacked serious substance. And you can see this in the hippie community. Because when I moved to the States, I made quite a few trips to different rainbow festivals. Rainbow Family is this family of hippies, and because anyhow, there's a lot of young people, dozens of thousands all in one place, so we used to go there. And you could see how they wanted to be spiritual, some of them, like that, and many of them would claim things such as love towards trees, this, that, the other thing, but very often you would see that these people in many ways would be selfish. Like they would claim love of trees, but then, if you know much about the hippie community, not everyone, please don't get me wrong, I don't mean to say that the whole community is like that, but there's a significant number of hippies people within the hippie community who are milkers, if you know that term. They go somewhere and they milk. In other words, they'll go to your home and they ask you if they could spend the night, and they'll spend another night, and yet another, empty your fridge. I just can't get rid of it. So, they would have respect for a tree, but no respect for you. Why? Because you cannot artificially respect someone or something. You have to see, in other words, if you're going to respect someone or something, that thing has to be respectable. And so then the question is, how do we respect, especially nasty people? How do we do that? Well, we do that because intrinsically, everyone's beautiful. Intrinsically, everyone's part and parcel of God, a beautiful divine spark that at the moment might be in ignorance and behaving ugly. But intrinsically, God is origin of everyone and everything. This is Vaishnava theology. And therefore, whatever we encounter and whoever we encounter, even they may not be very pleasant, we should understand them to be deserving of our service. Of course, appropriate service. I'm not going to give a bottle of beer to a drunk just because he asked. That's no help. But I should still make that person an object of kindness, and therefore appropriately help. But if you don't have this kind of deep understanding, then spirituality is unsatisfying, because you see, we all want to love and be loved. But how do you do that unless you have this vision, Yomam Pashati, you see everything within God and God within everything? Then love doesn't extend everywhere equally. Then you love some people and some people you kind of hate. But we all yearn for that constant state of intoxicated state of love of God. Once I was telling this to my mother, and at one point I caught myself, what are you saying? She'll think you're crazy. And then I apologized, and then she felt offended that I thought that she would feel offended, yeah. Because she actually agreed, she thought, yeah, that's actually a very good thought. So I was happy to hear that she didn't think I was being too far out.
Hare Krishna, Bhakti. I have a question.
Yes.
So, even I see scientists and advanced people who do not believe in God and take up yoga. So yoga doesn't have physical source. How do they relate to it, or how do they understand yoga as it doesn't?
Well, most people relate to yoga as just like most people relate to religion. most people, from my experience, growing up in Mediterranean Europe, where people are Catholics for the most part, and from experience traveling to India, people's concept of religion is equally meager. And that is that religion and God are just sort of like spice of life. You know, you do these things and then your life becomes better. In other words, no transcendental concept that there is a transcendental realm, that you exist as a spirit soul, that you're transcendental to material creation, that you love God, that the perfection of life is not just to be comfortable, but perfection of life is to be constantly in the state of love of God. And never losing sight of God, no matter what we may encounter. They don't have that concept. People treat yoga in the same way. It's just another entertainment in life. Something that somehow or other makes my life better. But transcendental teaching is that your life, this is not your life. Life is transcendental. Your biological existence is just chemical interaction that has nothing to do with you. Hardly anything to do with you. And so, of course, there are people who see yoga as something more than that, but for the most part, this is what people see yoga as. As a matter of fact, when you ask people, I remember this person. He was a chiropractor. I hurt my back and the devotees took me to a chiropractor. I didn't want to go, but they insisted, so okay, whatever, let's go. And then as he was treating me, of course you notice I was a monk, and we started a conversation about spirituality. And then he told me how he feels most spiritual when he surfs. This is Southern California, people surf waves, right? So he feels most spiritual when he surfs. In other words, he identified feeling of pleasure with being spiritual. There's a French author who said that how does that go? Happiness is the pleasure of sages. Happiness is the pleasure of sages. And pleasure is the happiness of madmen. In other words, sage lives for happiness and mad people live for pleasure. And so in their madness they equate pleasure with spirituality. In other words, when they experience serious amount of pleasure, they say, that was divine. Like there's a restaurant in LA called, of course it's an Italian restaurant, and it's called Divine Pasta. I'm not sure how divine the pasta is, but the point is, if you eat it, you'll feel this divine pleasure. So that's how people tend to relate to religion, to yoga, to hiking, to, whatever, everything. As mere means of entertainment, something that will make him feel good about, will give him some pleasure in this life. Rather than means for transcendental life.
The person practicing yoga is not so conducive for Krishna consciousness. If I find two persons, one says yoga, another person says I'm just not interested in yoga, who would I pick?
Oh, depends. Just like someone might be very much into sunsets. But we see the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita teaches that three modes of material nature bind soul to the material world. So the mode of goodness, which sometimes is actually described as liberating. There are statements in the Bhagavad Gita, there are statements in the 6th canto of the Bhagavatam that say that sattva liberates and actually frees one even from sinful reactions. But sattva also binds. So in other words, person might be very much attached to watching beautiful sunset like that. So it really depends. I mean, it really depends from case to case. Like even sometimes the devotees have debates. Is it easier to communicate Krishna consciousness to an Indian or non-Indian? Because generally speaking, those who are from India, they're culturally familiar with Krishna consciousness, so it's much easier. But then very often we'll find that they'll come to a certain level and not go past that level. They just like pull a parking brake. Oh, I feel very comfortable right here. Whereas, for example, someone who's just hamburger eater, which from Vedic point of view is a very uncivilized way of going about your eating business, very gross, might be a very good candidate. But yet in the Bhagavad Gita you have statements like Yesham tvanta gatam papam jananam punya karmana te dvandva moha vinirmukta bhajante mam drida vrata. That those who come to the point of worshipping God with drida vrata, powerful vow, strong immovable vow, and those who come to transcend the dualities of matter are people who are pious. Punya, karma, those who have acted piously for a long time. On the other hand, we see some people who have been acting piously for a long time just don't want to budge. They just don't want to move from that position. So, what's better? Hard to say. That's why sometimes Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur would say, please excuse the intensity of this analogy, but he would say, and Prabhupada repeated this, what's the difference between dry stool and wet stool? They're equally useless, just one is a little more nasty than the other. So, it really depends, but at times it could just be the difference between two types of poop. Okay, anything else? Yes.
Coming back to the happiness and pleasure.
Mm.
So, what we are feeling here, like by ecstatic kirtan or a powerful lecture, are we feeling the divine pleasure, or like a past?
Of course, here we have issue of language. Here we would have to define our terms, because your question is rather a question of how we're using these terms. Because you see, sometimes Srila Prabhupada literally equated Krishna consciousness to happiness. Krishna Bhakti Rasa Bhavitam, that's Bhakti Rasa Bhav. Like Anandamayo Vyasat, eternal nature of the soul is Ananda, happiness. So here what we're identifying as happiness is the pursuance of not pleasure but happiness. In other words, in order to understand Krishna consciousness or spiritual happiness, we're contrasting that to pleasure. And in this case, we would call pleasure sort of happiness derived from the contact of the senses with sense objects. Does that make sense?
Can you please elaborate?
A little more? Okay. If you were to pursue happiness rather than pleasure, you would come to understand God, the soul, and devotional, and the process of bhakti or devotional service. Because that is the eternal nature of the self, happiness. For example, a materialist does not pursue happiness but pleasure. So materialists would want to have a thinner and more expensive phone because it has more capabilities or a larger house, because that provides certain material comforts, material pleasure. But the sage or a holy person is someone who would pursue happiness. In other words, he would see the value of these things only in as much as they produce happiness. Now, if you study happiness, you will see that happiness ultimately is a form of Krishna consciousness. In other words, happiness that's not permanent, that doesn't stay, is again pleasure. It's not happiness. So in order to communicate the difference between the two, I use two different terms. This is not my division, this is this French author. He made this distinction between pleasure and happiness to help people differentiate that which is worth striving for as opposed to that which is not. Like if you think of pleasure as material happiness, you will see that always, as Krishna says in the Gita, has a beginning and an end. Like people identify a goal. I want to have a house on the hill. Or if you're in Southern California, you say, house on the beach. I want to have a house on the beach. Then you get the house on the beach. And then what? It's over. Then there's got to be something else. Then, more income because I feel insecure because, I don't know, tsunami. I mean, the list goes, it's endless. And whenever senses come in contact with sense objects, certain amount of pleasure is produced. And then that pleasure dissipates and turns into pain. That's the difference between pleasure and happiness.
So if
I just use European language, that's all. Had I instead of happiness said Krishna Prem, you would have no questions. But because I didn't, you have a lot of questions. But one thing that I really try to do a lot is to understand things by looking at them from varieties of points of view. In terms of usage of language, in terms of looking at things from different cultural paradigms, traditions, historic points, and so on. Because then you really get to understand things. Because again, they're placed in perspective. Also, people tend to become obtuse when they hear certain terms, like sense gratification. You're not this body. You hear this all the time and you stop hearing it. Even though someone said it, and it's an amazing message, but you stop hearing it. And you just switch terminology, and then, oh, wow, ooh, yeah, right. Same message. You're not the body. You're spirit, soul. You're parcel of God. You should serve God. You should love God. Same message always. There's no new message. Just different words. That's all. Let me off the hook now. Yes, please. Oh, by the way, I'm not sure how we're doing on time. I keep forgetting what the local schedule is, but when does the arati begin?
7:15.
Okay, so we have a couple more minutes. Yes, please.
I think there's a lot of confusion amongst devotees about what is sentimentality and what is a heart through which is flowing love, feelings. And from time to time, it is sometimes viewed that females are more sentimental. But I don't want to limit my question to that. How do we know when, mean, when I think about, if I ask myself, am I being sentimental? I think of it in terms of, do I have a range of feelings which are not motivating me to act in the highest way. So I might just, back to the sunset analogy, I might just be awash with the appreciation for the sunset. But it isn't, it isn't the mood that is causing me to fall at the feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead in gratitude for His creation and giving me the eyes to appreciate it. And I could have made many analogies, but my question basically is, what is the difference? Because I feel, myself included, many times I hear devotees maybe being diminutive towards the human heart and the range of ecstatic emotions that can flow through it, and sort of minimizing it down to sentimentality. But then sometimes it's possible it's correct. Maybe it is only sentimentality. So how does one know? How can one appropriately question oneself, not so much others, but oneself, about am I being sentimental, or are these more fixed up than that?
Yeah, very powerful question. Before I answer it, I like to present a problem that we encounter generally when we try to self-assess. The basic problem is that we understand the world through the media of our own consciousness. And so therefore, in the process of Krishna consciousness, in the Vedic process of self-realization, it is of utmost importance to first purify one's consciousness. In other words, because our consciousness will define what we see and how we see when we look, no matter what we look, no matter what we look at. And so this is a big difficulty. It's a huge difficulty. And this is one of the reasons for which everyone is advised. Sometimes it's even stated you cannot make progress in Krishna consciousness unless you're guided by a spiritual, what's the term, mentor, which basically means spiritual master, guru, whatever, spiritual teacher. But one has to have a mentor. In other words, it is very helpful if one has a person who's of such spiritual stature, with such spiritual experience and deep wisdom and life experience, that this person will help us differentiate reality from illusion. Because we often will look and we darn cannot tell. Or even when we're convinced that we're seeing one thing, what we're looking at is actually a different thing. And so, same thing with emotions. And first of all, it is very normal that certain people are some people are less emotional. Even though we're all emotional to some extent. But some people are prone to be a little more emotional, some not as much. And that's perfectly normal. We see even within spiritual creation, they're in what we call Krishna Lila and Krishna's pastimes. They're perfect beings, so to speak, who are more or less emotional, some more rational, some more emotional. So all of this, our rational self and our emotional self, they both have their place in Krishna consciousness. And to write someone off because they're maybe not as rational but a little more emotional is to make a mistake. Now, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur wrote a brilliant piece. I can't remember the title of it, but it deals with the function of intelligence. And he said that the intelligence, the rational side in us, is not meant to replace or even hamper or restrict the activities of the emotional self, but it's meant to guide our emotional side to its full development, meaning it in Krishna consciousness. By the way, I saw once a cartoon drawing. There was an image of a heart with legs and hands, and there was an image of a brain just opposite to it in the same image of a brain with arms and legs, and the heart had what you call what's the English word? When you cut yourself, what do you put? Band-aid. Had two bandages, in the cross fashion, right? And it was all bruised up, and the brain was telling it, "I told you." Because we often, judge things merely on emotional basis, and then end up in trouble. A guy sees a girl, oh, she's so cute, and then they, come together and have a really bad life. Or other way around. Oh, he's so cute, and then they have a really bad relationship. So each of those two have their purposes in our lives. And they're supposed to kick into gear or kick in when we need it. And so to allow ourselves to be emotionally carried into the land of illusion would be mere sentimentalism. And we all have, even the most emotional being has a rational side, has the rational tool, the intelligence. And that intelligence, it ought to kick in when the emotional side is becoming ridiculous, and to bring one back to the world, to the real world, to Krishna's world, the world of God consciousness, the world of Krishna consciousness, within which emotion can fully exist to its heart's content, so to speak. But again, how do we tell? That's a very, am I just being overly emotional right now, going into the sentimental la-la land, or this is a genuine spiritual emotion? Sometimes it's very difficult to tell. And so, therefore, there are checks and balances such as, of course, we have the Shastra, the written, which is basically written message of a sage, of a saintly person, or Krishna himself, God himself. And then we have other sages, meaning other devotees, that we can consult. And then there's also, if we're fortunate enough to have in our lives a spiritual guide, someone we can confide in. I know so many devotees, having served as a temple president for 15 years almost now, I got to see a side of devotees who were spiritual teachers to other devotees. And so the students, the disciples of these teachers, they don't know this side, may not know the side of their teachers, but they have teachers. They have amongst themselves, amongst their, we call them God brothers, right? Guru Bhais. They have a friend in Krishna consciousness who they consider very spiritually mature, in whom they confide and by whom they run their thoughts and plans and ideas and problems, and can go with their questions and so on. So even very elevated devotees, most of these devotees were initiated by Srila Prabhupada, who's not around anymore. But they still have a guru figure in their lives. The other thing is also that we that even if someone is not necessarily much more elevated than ourselves, very often another person would know something that we don't know, just because they're not in our shoes. Meaning they're not drowning in our own world, but they're looking at our world from a different perspective. Thank you. So, I think it's time.
You know, the kids want to sing something. 5 minutes. Kids want to sing a bhajan or something.
Sure.
Practice.